Jim, this is quickly becoming my fascination because it does feel like sci-fi, the idea that you could have data centers in space. How far away are we from that being a reality?
Yeah, well, first, welcome to the club. I've been thinking about this for about 10 years and have been filing patents in various different companies for data centers in space. And it's a reality. I think it's a number of years off, like my good friend Dirk said. What we're doing at Phantom Space is the idea eventually of creating a space app store in space where our children, our grandchildren, billions of people around the world can run code from space, much like your iPhone, and create great value from that data that's generated in space. The others that you mentioned, Elon and so forth, are thinking about taking these big data centers and putting them into space because of the power and the environmental impact that lacks in space. And two different approaches and two different results. And I think what you'll see is over the next 100 years, the space economy will be seen as a frontier, much like the New World was 500 years ago. And this is part of the infrastructure that we have to build out.
So in building that infrastructure, what are the biggest bottlenecks? What are the biggest challenges you need to overcome? I'm guessing there might be some physics bottlenecks of actually getting things like data centers out in space, or maybe even building the space app store. What still needs to be worked out?
Yeah, so if you talk about data centers on the Earth, they're megawatts, right? And to date, individual satellites can probably only produce kilowatts worth of data center power. And the real issue, the real restriction bottleneck is launch. And there are very few companies that control launch. And from the beginning, Phantom Space, we built in launch into our business plan. And believe it or not, 25 years ago when I was with SpaceX, that was our original playbook we wrote, was build the launch vehicle yourself, build the satellites yourself, and you can scale a constellation. It's kind of like living on one side of a very large river like the Mississippi, and you can't get to the other side without a boat. The rockets are sort of the modern day version or future version of boats that cross the Atlantic or the rivers.
I have to say, I just have a lot of elementary questions about this, so please forgive all of my ignorance, because, again, it's okay. Fascinating to me. But what about, I'm assuming things need to be maintenance, that chips need to be replaced. Apparently the chip replacement cycle is something like every 5 years. Isn't that extremely difficult if all the stuff is up in space?
Yeah, it is. And this is why you have to control launch. If you look at SpaceX, they use 85–90% of their capacity right now for Starlink. And Starlink's a great worldwide internet system. When they start doing much larger systems in space, that replacement cycle will still be there. Technically, a lot of these chips can last 20, 30 years in space. Many of them have, but it's like your iPhone, after a few years, it won't run the software anymore. So you get a new one because it's got better chips. And so what we see is the future where spacecraft and satellites are replaced on a 5-year cycle. You let the old ones burn up in the atmosphere just to not create space junk, and that's why you have to control launch. Launch is the foundation of all these companies. So, investors, as they're looking at the future of space and where to invest, you look at those who control launch, and launch is a very, very high moat, kind of competitive moat endeavor. It takes a lot of time, it takes specific talent that's rare, and it takes a lot of capital to get there. So once you have that, again, you're like the countries in Europe that had an ability to cross the Atlantic and colonize the New World.
Are you talking with any of the big tech, the big hyperscalers about this? I know what you're trying to create is something a little bit separate about a space app store, but also building some of the infrastructure. I wonder, considering all the patents and technology you have you been approached by any of the hyperscalers who've been building data centers on Earth that maybe want to partner with you to recreate the same thing in outer space?
Yeah, we have on our board of directors the founder of Compass Data Centers, for example. So we have a tremendous amount of interest from that world. I can't name names, but we have several publicly traded companies that we're in deep discussions for both a very large investment in our Series C funding round, as well as some very large customer contracts that would extend into names that you guys all talk about all day long. So the interest is there. The problem in the space industry is there's a lot of people who just aren't credible, and you have to be able to sift through that. So I think that's the phase the industry is going through right now is to try to find out who's credible. Obviously, the three you mentioned earlier are very credible. We're less well known, but I'm known as the father of the data center concept, so that tends to draw people in. We've got a very concrete, although quiet, plan we've been executing on for the last 6 years to get it done.
Okay, that's interesting, because here on Earth, not exactly the same conversation, but a flavor it's happening of you have, yes, data centers being built with active leases being signed by hyperscalers, by OpenAI, and then there's this other speculative build happening and maybe speculative energy being put on the map, and are we going to overbuild it? Does the same risk exist for space? If a lot of people are coming in and maybe not all of them are credible, is there a risk that we overlaunch satellites into Earth's orbit, that we just go too far in an arms race for data centers in outer space?
Yeah, probably not in my lifetime, because launch is still very scarce. Despite this gigantic vehicle they call Starship that SpaceX has been launching, there's just not enough launch capacity out there for the satellites that are being built present. So that's always going to be a choke point. And if you solve that, you still have where you can launch from. I can't launch from a Walmart parking lot, so I have to go from federal ranges, and those are about over capacity at the moment. Very quietly, the U.S. government's trying to help solve that, along with states like Arizona. We're trying to build a spaceport there. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's also a huge market that can draw into this that is really orthogonal to the terrestrial space data market. What we hear from the hyperscalers is they're looking for unique data, right, that they can use to train their large language models, and that unique data resides in space. That's why we're focused on the Space App Store and putting compute near where these zettabytes of data are being generated and not being used because they can't get it back down.
How does funding look for this? More broadly in AI and data centers, funding markets have been wide open, be it for the hyperscalers, be it for others. Does the same exist for the types of projects you're undergoing?
Well, if you're certain companies, you can almost raise an infinite amount of money. For most of the rest of us, we went through an asset bubble about 2021 and 22 that has burst and it's finally coming back. So it's been, for many, particularly involved with launch, very difficult to raise money in the private capital markets. That's changed. But what people are looking for are quality teams, and they're looking for quality business plans and something different than just building rockets, even though the world still needs all the rockets it can get. Yeah, we think that will continue to improve. And particularly with this advent of AI and large language models and applying it into space, we think that's one of the killer apps, and I have for 10 years now. So I'm not really surprised. You just have to be patient in this business because it takes a long time.